Captain Zara Viper Kane had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Thunder Ridge for 10 months, and most days she felt like a shadow drifting through the hangar bays. At 29, she moved with the calculated grace of someone who had learned that action spoke infinitely louder than arguments. Her desert camouflage flight suit hung with military precision, her black hair secured in a regulation bun that somehow made her disappear into the background of every mission briefing she attended. The other pilots at FOB Thunder Ridge had developed an almost supernatural ability to overlook her entirely. Just 3 days ago, Lieutenant Derek Hayes had walked past her maintenance station and casually dropped a stack of requisition forms on her workbench. "Hey, can you get these processed through supply?" "Thanks, sweetheart." He hadn't even paused to see if she'd agreed, simply assumed that the quiet woman checking aircraft systems must be administrative support rather than a qualified pilot with more flight hours than half his squadron. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of them knew was that Zara's service record contained missions that officially never existed. Operations in the mountains of Pakistan, where she'd learned to navigate by star patterns when GPS satellites were jammed. Night insertions in hostile territory where the difference between success and catastrophe came down to reading wind currents by the sound they made through canyon walls. Her flight gear contained equipment that wasn't part of standard issue: a backup altimeter calibrated for extreme elevation changes, hand-copied charts showing atmospheric pressure variations in mountain terrain, and emergency navigation techniques developed during classified operations that had pushed the boundaries of what helicopter pilots thought possible. But Zara had learned something crucial during her 8 years of military service. Competence that demanded recognition usually got you transferred to missions you didn't want. Better to be underestimated and useful than celebrated and reassigned to desk duty in some Pentagon basement. So she kept her expertise quiet, performed her assigned transport missions flawlessly, and spent her off-duty hours studying weather patterns and terrain features that other pilots considered irrelevant details. The morning routine at FOB Thunder Ridge followed the same predictable pattern every day. Pilots gathered in the briefing room at 0600 hours for mission assignments and intelligence updates. Major Sarah Barnes, the chief pilot, would review the day's operations while junior officers took notes and senior pilots offered commentary based on their experience. Zara typically sat in the back corner, close enough to hear everything but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. She'd developed her own system for processing the information presented during these briefings, while other pilots focused on their specific assignments. Zara absorbed details about weather conditions across the entire operational area, emergency landing sites that weren't on standard charts, and communication dead zones where standard radio protocols failed. She maintained a personal database of information that seemed useless for routine transport missions, but might prove critical if conditions ever exceeded normal parameters. Her quarters reflected this methodical approach to preparation. The walls were covered with topographical maps marked with her own annotations, wind patterns during different seasons, natural landmarks visible from various altitudes, and alternative routes through mountain passes that could provide shelter from hostile fire or severe weather. She'd spent hundreds of hours correlating this information with historical weather data and incident reports, building a comprehensive understanding of how to fly in conditions that would ground most aircraft. The other pilots knew her as the quiet woman who flew supply runs without complaint and maintained her aircraft to standards that exceeded military requirements. They didn't know that she'd studied every emergency landing site within a 200-mile radius, memorized backup communication frequencies for situations where standard protocols failed, or developed techniques for flying in weather conditions that the manual classified as prohibitive. Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper, The maintenance chief had worked with Zara on dozens of routine inspections and had begun to notice something unusual about her approach to aircraft preparation. She checked systems that other pilots ignored, tested equipment that rarely failed, and asked technical questions that suggested a deeper understanding of helicopter capabilities than her transport assignments would require. "Kane," he'd said, the previous week while watching her perform what should have been a routine pre-flight inspection, "you check this bird like you're planning to fly it through a hurricane." "Just being thorough, Chief," she'd replied, continuing her methodical examination of backup navigation equipment that most pilots never touched. Cooper had shrugged and moved on, but something about her intensity had stuck with him. There was a difference between standard military precision and the kind of preparation that came from expecting the unexpected. Zara Kane prepared for emergencies that weren't in the manual. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez, the communications specialist, had also noticed Zara's unusual attention to details that other pilots considered irrelevant. She regularly asked about radio propagation in mountain terrain, backup frequency protocols, and emergency communication procedures for situations where standard equipment failed. "Most pilots learn the basics and figure that's enough," Mendez had explained to a colleague. "Kane studies this stuff like she's preparing for communications to fail in the middle of hostile territory." What Mendez didn't know was that Zara had operated in exactly those conditions during missions that didn't appear in official records. She'd learned that when everything went wrong simultaneously, survival often came down to details that seemed unimportant during routine operations. The base operated on the assumption that emergency situations would follow predictable patterns and remain within manageable parameters. Standard operating procedures covered most contingencies, and backup plans addressed situations that exceeded normal risk levels. But Zara had experienced conditions where standard procedures became limitations rather than guidelines, where backup plans weren't adequate, and where survival required capabilities that weren't taught in flight school. She kept these experiences to herself, partly because the missions were classified and partly because she'd learned that expertise without context often sounded like bragging or paranoia. Instead, she continued her quiet preparation, maintaining skills that officially didn't exist while flying routine missions that didn't challenge her capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was probably the most qualified pilot on the base for operations in extreme conditions, but she was assigned to the safest, most routine missions available. While other pilots competed for challenging assignments that would advance their careers, Zara flew supply runs and maintained readiness for emergencies that everyone hoped would never occur. But she'd learned something important during her years of classified operations. The most dangerous assumptions were the ones people made about capabilities they couldn't see. And in a place where assumptions about gender, experience, and qualifications determined who got trusted with critical missions, being underestimated might prove to be the most valuable asset she possessed. As Zara completed her evening equipment check-in, prepared for another night of studying weather patterns and terrain features, she had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, 8 Navy SEALs would be trapped behind enemy lines in conditions that would test every assumption FOB Thunder Ridge had ever made about what was possible and who was qualified to attempt the impossible. What the pilots at FOB Thunder Ridge didn't know about Captain Zara Kane could fill a classified file cabinet. Her official service record showed standard helicopter operations, routine transport missions, and flawless safety ratings. What it didn't show were the missions that officially never happened. Operations so sensitive that they were buried in compartmentalized intelligence archives, accessible only to personnel with clearances that didn't exist on paper. Zara's real education had begun 3 years earlier during Operation Nightfall, a classified insertion mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. She'd been selected not for her gender or any diversity initiative, but because she possessed a rare combination of technical skills and psychological profile that made her ideal for missions where failure meant death for entire special operations teams. The mission briefing had taken place in a windowless room at Bagram Air Base, delivered by intelligence officers whose names she never learned. "You'll be flying a modified Black Hawk into terrain that doesn't appear on our maps," the lead briefer had explained. "GPS will be unreliable due to atmospheric interference. Standard navigation equipment will fail at critical moments. Radio communication will be intermittent at best." Most pilots would have considered those conditions prohibitive. Zara had listened carefully and asked technical questions that revealed a mind capable of processing multiple failure scenarios simultaneously. How would engine performance change at extreme altitude? What were the backup communication protocols if primary frequencies were jammed? How could she calculate fuel consumption when normal flight patterns wouldn't apply? The intelligence officers had exchanged glances. They'd briefed dozens of pilots for high-risk missions, but few asked questions that demonstrated such comprehensive understanding of compound failure modes. They'd made the right choice. During that first classified operation, Zara had learned to fly using techniques that weren't taught in any military manual. When her GPS system failed due to electronic interference from enemy jamming equipment, she'd navigated by reading the way engine sound reflected off invisible canyon walls. When radio communication became impossible, she'd used pre-arranged visual signals and timing protocols to coordinate with ground teams. When weather conditions deteriorated beyond anything covered in standard training, she'd flown by instinct and physics, reading air currents through the way they affected rotor performance. The mission had succeeded. 8 special operations soldiers had been extracted from hostile territory under conditions that should have made flying impossible. But success came with a cost. Zara now possessed skills that were both invaluable and officially non-existent. Over the following 2 years, she'd participated in 17 more classified operations. Each mission had taught her something new about the limits of human capability and mechanical reliability. She'd learned to calculate fuel consumption when normal flight patterns were impossible. She'd mastered emergency landing techniques for terrain that offered no suitable landing zones. She'd developed an intuitive understanding of how helicopters behaved in conditions that exceeded their design specifications. More importantly, she'd learned to think several steps ahead of disaster. While other pilots focused on standard operating procedures, Zara had trained herself to identify the moment when procedures became limitations. She could recognize the signs that indicated when following the manual would get people killed and when survival required making decisions that contradicted everything she'd been taught in flight school. Her personal equipment reflected this specialized training. Hidden in her quarters were items that weren't part of standard pilot gear: a backup altimeter designed for extreme altitude variations, hand-copied atmospheric charts showing pressure patterns in mountain terrain, and emergency beacon frequencies that worked when standard communication systems failed. She'd acquired these tools during missions that didn't exist, and maintained them for emergencies that everyone hoped would never occur. The most valuable skill she'd developed was something the military called acoustic navigation, but which pilots who possessed it simply thought of as flying by sound. When electronic systems failed and visual references disappeared, experienced pilots could navigate by listening to how engine noise and rotor wash reflected off terrain features. It was an ancient technique developed by early aviators who'd learned to fly without instruments, refined by military pilots who operated in conditions where technology couldn't be trusted. Zara had mastered this skill during a mission where her helicopter's entire electrical system had been fried by an electromagnetic pulse. She'd navigated 47 miles through hostile mountain terrain in complete darkness, guided only by the way her engine sound bounced off canyon walls and the subtle changes in air pressure that indicated elevation changes. She'd landed at a forward operating base with 4 wounded Special Forces operators who wouldn't have survived another 10 minutes of delay, but these missions existed only in compartmentalized files that would never be opened. During routine personnel reviews, as far as official records were concerned, Captain Zara Kane was a competent transport pilot with no special qualifications for high-risk operations. She'd made peace with this contradiction. The missions had taught her that recognition often mattered less than capability, and that the most reliable people were frequently the ones who didn't need credit for their competence. She'd continued her quiet preparation, maintaining skills that officially didn't exist while performing routine duties that didn't challenge her abilities. Her current assignment at FOB Thunder Ridge was supposed to be a rest rotation, a chance to decompress from the psychological stress of classified operations. She was flying routine supply missions, maintaining her aircraft to exceptional standards, and studying local terrain features as a form of professional development. Nobody expected her to need the specialized skills she developed during missions that officially never happened. But Zara had learned something important during her classified operations. Emergencies didn't announce themselves in advance, and the most dangerous situations were often the ones that began as routine missions. So she continued her methodical preparation, studying weather patterns that seemed irrelevant for supply runs, memorizing communication protocols that exceeded standard requirements, and maintaining equipment that other pilots considered unnecessary. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez had begun to notice the depth of her technical knowledge during their routine interactions. When she asked about emergency communication procedures, her questions demonstrated understanding of radio propagation theory that went far beyond standard pilot training. When she requested information about local weather patterns, she asked about atmospheric conditions that would only matter during extreme flight operations. Kane asks questions like she's planning to fly in conditions that would ground everything else on the base. Mendez had mentioned to Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper during a routine maintenance discussion. Cooper had nodded thoughtfully. He'd noticed similar patterns in Zara's approach to aircraft maintenance. She checked systems that rarely failed, tested equipment that other pilots ignored, and maintained her helicopter to standards that exceeded normal requirements. There was a difference between military precision and the kind of preparation that came from expecting multiple, simultaneous failures. What neither of them realized was that Zara's preparation wasn't paranoia or perfectionism. It was the result of training and experience in conditions where the difference between success and catastrophe could come down to details that seemed unimportant during routine operations. She'd learned to prepare for emergencies that weren't in the manual because she'd survived situations where the manual hadn't been adequate. As Zara continued her quiet routine of exceptional preparation and routine missions, she remained unaware that her specialized skills were about to become critically important. 8 Navy SEALs were operating behind enemy lines, confident that their mission parameters fell within acceptable risk levels and that backup support would be available if conditions deteriorated beyond normal expectations. They had no way of knowing that within hours they would find themselves in exactly the kind of situation that Zara Kane had been preparing for her entire career. The announcement came during Tuesday morning's operations briefing, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic certainty that brooked no discussion. Colonel Nathan Pierce stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face carrying the expression of a commander who had made a decision based on factors that others wouldn't understand or appreciate. Effective immediately, Pierce announced to the assembled pilots, all female aviators will be restricted to transport operations within the secure perimeter. No exceptions, no appeals, no discussion. The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of rotor blades from the flight line. 32 pilots sat in their chairs, processing an announcement that fundamentally altered the operational structure they'd worked within for months. Zara felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral, maintaining the same professional composure that had served her well during far more dangerous situations. Lieutenant Derek Hayes leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression that he didn't bother to hide. He'd been vocal about his opinions regarding female pilots in combat roles, though he'd always been careful to phrase his objections in terms of unit cohesion and operational efficiency, rather than direct discrimination. Now his preferred policies were being implemented at the command level, validating assumptions he'd held but rarely expressed in official settings. Finally, he whispered to Captain Alex Torres, who sat beside him looking distinctly uncomfortable with the new directive. Combat operations require split-second decision-making and physical strength. This just makes logical sense. Major Zara Barnes, the chief pilot, had been noticeably absent from the decision-making process that led to this announcement. She'd built her career on merit-based assignments and had consistently argued that pilot qualifications should be evaluated independently of gender considerations. But Colonel Pierce had made this decision during a command conference that included only senior male officers, and Barnes had learned about the new policy at the same time as everyone else. Zara remained motionless in her back row seat, but her mind was processing the implications with the same analytical precision she applied to flight planning. This wasn't just a policy change. It was a fundamental redefinition of how the base evaluated pilot capabilities. Instead of assessing individual qualifications and experience, command was now making assumptions based on gender categories that had nothing to do with flying ability. After the briefing, she approached Colonel Pierce's administrative assistant, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, hoping to request clarification on the new restrictions and their implementation timeline. Sergeant Walsh, Zara said, maintaining professional courtesy despite the frustration burning in her chest, I'd like to request a meeting with Colonel Pierce to discuss the new flight restrictions. Walsh barely glanced up from her paperwork. The Colonel's directive was clear, Captain. Transport duties within the secure perimeter. No exceptions were mentioned. I understand the basic policy, Zara replied carefully, but I'd like to discuss how it applies to pilots with specialized training and experience in. Captain Kane, Walsh interrupted, using a tone that suggested the conversation was already concluded. Your service record shows transport operations. That's exactly what you'll continue doing. The Colonel doesn't need to explain policies that are based on operational requirements. Zara stood there for several seconds, feeling the familiar weight of being dismissed before her qualifications had even been considered. She could have mentioned her classified operations experience, her specialized navigation training, or her proven ability to fly in conditions that would ground other aircraft. Instead, she nodded once and walked away, understanding that this conversation was representative of a larger, institutional mindset that wouldn't be changed through individual appeals. That evening, she sat in her quarters with topographical maps spread across her desk, continuing the same routine preparation that had characterized her entire deployment. While other pilots gathered in the recreation area to discuss the policy changes and their implications, Zara studied terrain features and weather patterns with renewed intensity. The restriction felt like more than a policy change. It felt like a door closing on capabilities that had been developed through years of dangerous training and life-threatening missions. But she'd learned during her classified operations that dwelling on unfairness was a luxury that people in high-stakes situations couldn't afford. Instead of focusing on the injustice, she channeled her energy into preparation for scenarios that others weren't considering. Her hand-drawn maps now included detailed annotations about alternative approach routes through the mountain terrain surrounding FOB Thunder Ridge. She'd identified natural wind corridors that could provide protected flight paths during severe weather, emergency landing sites that weren't marked on official charts, and communication dead zones where standard radio protocols would fail. This information seemed irrelevant for routine transport missions within the secure perimeter, But Zara had learned to prepare for conditions that exceeded normal parameters. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez found her in the communication center. Later that evening, reviewing emergency frequency protocols that went far beyond standard requirements. "Captain," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard, "I heard about the new restrictions. That's gotta be frustrating." Zara continued studying the frequency charts without looking up. "Policies change, Sergeant. My job is to remain ready for whatever missions I'm assigned." Mendez noticed that she was reviewing communication procedures for situations where primary systems failed completely. "These protocols are for extreme emergency conditions. Way beyond anything we'd need for routine transport operations." "It's good to stay current on all procedures," Zara replied neutrally. But something in her tone suggested she was preparing for emergencies that others were anticipating. As she folded the charts and prepared to return to her quarters, Mendez couldn't shake the feeling that Captain Kane was preparing for something specific. Her questions about emergency communications, her detailed study of local terrain, and her methodical approach to equipment maintenance suggested someone who expected to need capabilities that weren't required for transport duties within the FOB Secure Perimeter. Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper had similar observations about Zara's maintenance procedures. Despite being restricted to routine supply runs, she continued maintaining her helicopter to standards that exceeded normal requirements. She checked systems that rarely failed during routine operations, tested equipment that other pilots considered backup systems, and maintained her aircraft with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she expected to need maximum reliability under extreme conditions. "Kane maintains that bird like she's planning to fly it through hell," Cooper mentioned to Major Barnes during a routine maintenance review. Barnes had been struggling with the new restrictions since their implementation. She'd built her career on the principle that competence should determine mission assignments, and the blanket exclusion of female pilots contradicted everything she believed about merit-based leadership. "What's your assessment of Kane's capabilities?" Barnes asked, knowing that Cooper had worked with pilots throughout his 20-year career and could evaluate competence independently of politics. Cooper considered the question carefully. "She's the most thorough pilot I've worked with. Checks everything twice, asks technical questions that show deep understanding of aircraft systems, and maintains her equipment to standards that I wish everyone followed. If I had to pick one pilot to trust with my life in an emergency situation..." He paused, realizing the implications of what he was saying. "Let's just say the new restrictions don't make sense from a technical perspective." As the first week under the new policy concluded, a pattern began to emerge. Female pilots were relegated to routine duties, while male pilots handled increasingly challenging missions. The restriction was presented as a temporary security measure, but no timeline was provided for review or reconsideration. It was becoming clear that this change represented a fundamental shift in how FOB Thunder Ridge evaluated pilot qualifications. Zara adapted to her new reality with the same professional competence she'd always demonstrated, but she continued her intensive preparation with renewed focus. She'd learned during her classified operations that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones people made about capabilities they couldn't see. And in a place where assumptions about gender and qualifications now determined who was trusted with critical missions, being underestimated might prove to be more valuable than recognition. As she completed her evening preparation routine, studying weather patterns and communication protocols that seemed irrelevant for her restricted duties, Zara had no way of knowing that 8 Navy SEALs were beginning an operation that would soon test every assumption FOB Thunder Ridge had made about who was qualified to attempt the impossible. The humiliation escalated during Thursday morning's pre-flight briefing when Zara arrived early, as was her custom, to review weather data and aircraft maintenance reports. She'd spread her hand-drawn topographical maps across a corner table. annotating wind patterns and terrain features that could prove critical during emergency operations. The maps represented hundreds of hours of careful study, correlating official surveys with local intelligence reports and historical weather data. Lieutenant Derek Hayes noticed her work and approached with his coffee mug, flanked by two junior pilots who had recently arrived at FOB Thunder Ridge. Captain Rick Donovan and Lieutenant Mike Foster were eager to establish their credentials with the more experienced aviators, and Hayes had positioned himself as their informal mentor in base politics and operational procedures. "Still working on your art projects, Kane?" Hayes said loud enough for the entire briefing room to hear. He picked up one of her carefully annotated charts, examining the detailed markings that showed natural wind corridors, emergency landing zones, and communication dead spots throughout the regional terrain. "That Chinook isn't for practice flights, sweetheart," Donovan added, trying to impress Hayes with his casual dismissiveness. "Maybe stick to supply runs where creativity doesn't matter." Zara said nothing, but her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She methodically folded the map back into her flight jacket pocket, the same map that contained terrain analysis which could save lives if conditions ever exceeded normal parameters. Around the briefing room, other pilots glanced over with expressions ranging from amusement to uncomfortable awareness that the mockery was crossing professional boundaries. "I heard she thinks she's some kind of tactical pilot," whispered Captain Lisa Martinez to her co-pilot. "Transport duty getting to her head." Master Sergeant Tommy Wright, the senior enlisted advisor, overheard the comment and felt compelled to contribute his perspective. Wright had 25 years of military experience and considered himself an authority on pilot psychology and gender dynamics in aviation units. "Female pilots are perfectly capable for supply operations," Wright announced to the group, using the tone of someone delivering objective analysis rather than personal opinion. "But high-risk extractions require different skill sets. Physical strength for extended flight operations, aggressive decision-making under hostile fire." Not trying to be discriminatory, just realistic about operational requirements. Zara continued her equipment check, but Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez noticed the way her hands had stilled on her clipboard. Mendez had been working with Zara on communication protocols for months, observing her technical knowledge and professional competence with growing respect. "Captain Kane has been asking some pretty advanced questions about emergency navigation procedures," Mendez said quietly, attempting to redirect the conversation toward her demonstrated capabilities. "Stuff about flying when all electronic systems fail. Acoustic navigation techniques." Hayes laughed dismissively. "Acoustic navigation? What is this, World War I? Next she'd be telling us about navigating by the stars and reading tea leaves." What none of them knew was that acoustic navigation had kept Zara alive during a classified extraction in the Hindu Kush Mountains when her helicopter's entire electrical system had been destroyed by an electromagnetic pulse. She'd navigated 63 miles through hostile territory using engine sound reflection and atmospheric pressure changes, delivering 8 wounded special operations soldiers to safety when conventional navigation would have resulted in their deaths. But those missions existed only in compartmentalized files that would never be referenced during routine personnel discussions. As far as official records were concerned, Captain Zara Kane was a transport pilot with no special qualifications for high-risk operations. The mockery continued throughout the morning as word spread about the artistic maps and old-fashioned navigation techniques. Pilots who had never spoken to Zara directly began offering opinions about her competence and suitability for various types of missions. The conversation took on the casual cruelty of group dynamics where one person's perceived weakness becomes entertainment for others. "Probably watched too many movies about maverick pilots," suggested Lieutenant Foster, eager to contribute to the ongoing ridicule. "Reality is different from Hollywood fantasies." Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper, who had worked with Zara on aircraft maintenance for months, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. He'd observed her technical knowledge and attention to detail firsthand, recognizing competence that went far beyond what her current assignments required. Kane maintains her aircraft to higher standards than anyone else on this base, Cooper sighed, attempting to inject some factual perspective into the discussion. She asks technical questions that show deep understanding of helicopter systems and emergency procedures. That's exactly the problem, Hayes replied, seizing on Cooper's comment as validation of his position. She's overthinking everything. Combat aviation requires instinct and confidence, not obsessive preparation and backup plans for backup plans. The irony was devastating. Hayes was criticizing precisely the qualities that had made Zara invaluable during classified operations, where overthinking and obsessive preparation were the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But that irony was invisible to pilots who had never operated in conditions where following standard procedures would result in death. The real blow came during the afternoon maintenance briefing when Colonel Pierce made an announcement that sent ripples of tension through the assembled personnel. Due to enhanced security protocols, Pierce declared, all female pilots will be paired with male co-pilots for any flights outside the immediate base perimeter. This policy is non-negotiable and effective immediately. Zara felt the words hit her like a physical impact. After 10 months of flawless solo operations, she was suddenly being treated like a pilot who couldn't be trusted with independent command authority. Around the briefing room, male pilots exchanged glances that ranged from uncomfortable awareness to barely concealed satisfaction. Sir, Zara said, raising her hand with careful respect, I'd like to request review of this policy based on my mission completion record and safety ratings. Pierce didn't even look in her direction. The policy is based on operational security requirements, not individual performance metrics. Discussion is closed. Hayes leaned back in his chair with undisguised satisfaction. Finally, some common sense around here. After the briefing, Zara found herself alone in the maintenance hangar, staring at her Chinook helicopter. 10 months of exceptional performance, flawless safety records, and professional competence had been rendered irrelevant by policies based on assumptions about gender rather than demonstrated capability. Technical Sergeant Mendez approached her, cautiously, recognizing the controlled anger in her posture. Captain, you holding up okay? Zara turned, and Mendez was surprised by the steel in her expression. I'm fine, Sergeant. Just thinking. About what? About how interesting it is that policies change so quickly around here, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Makes me wonder what would happen if there was ever a real emergency, the kind where standard procedures weren't adequate. Mendez frowned, sensing undercurrents in her statement that he didn't fully understand. What do you mean? Zara picked up her maintenance checklist, her voice remaining professionally detached. I mean that rules are easy to implement when everything's routine, but emergencies have a way of revealing what actually matters versus what people think matters. She didn't elaborate, but something in her tone made Mendez pay careful attention. Over the next 24 hours, he would remember this conversation and begin to understand that Captain Zara Kane had been preparing for conditions that the rest of FOB Thunder Ridge couldn't even imagine. As Zara completed her post-maintenance inspection, she made mental notes about her emergency equipment. The backup navigation tools, the emergency frequency charts, and the hand-copied procedures for flying in impossible conditions. All of it might become critically important sooner than anyone expected, because while Colonel Pierce and his pilots were implementing policies based on assumptions about gender and capability, hostile forces were preparing operations that would test every assumption FOB Thunder Ridge had ever made about who was qualified to save lives when everything went catastrophically wrong. The emergency call shattered the routine atmosphere of FOB Thunder Ridge at 14:32 hours on Friday, cutting through normal radio chatter like a scream that would haunt everyone who heard it. Zara was in the maintenance hangar performing her daily inspection of Chinook Thunder 6 when the distress signal crackled through every communication system on the base. "Mayday, Mayday, Alpha Team down. Repeat, SEAL Team Alpha is down." The voice was strained, punctuated by the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire in the background. 8 personnel, multiple casualties. GPS coordinates unreliable. Require immediate extraction. Heavy enemy contact. The command center erupted into controlled chaos within seconds. Officers rushed to their stations. Maps appeared on tactical displays, and radio operators desperately tried to re-establish contact with the downed team. The base's emergency protocols, designed for situations that fell within predictable parameters, suddenly seemed inadequate for the crisis unfolding in the mountains. Zara dropped her maintenance checklist and rushed toward the command center, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate anticipation. This was exactly the kind of emergency she'd been preparing for during her months of quiet study and methodical equipment checks. But when she reached the briefing room, Colonel Pierce was already addressing his hand-picked emergency response. Team 8 male pilots stood around the tactical display, their faces grim as they reviewed mission parameters that seemed to worsen with each passing minute. Zara slipped in through the back entrance, positioning herself near the communications station, where she could monitor incoming weather data and intelligence updates. What she saw on the screens made her blood run cold. SEAL Team Alpha had been conducting a reconnaissance mission in the Coast Province Mountains when they'd been ambushed by a larger enemy force. Their helicopter had been shot down during the firefight, leaving 8 Navy SEALs stranded in terrain so remote and hostile that standard extraction procedures were proving inadequate. "Chief," Petty Officer Derek Stone's voice came through the radio again, weaker this time but still maintaining professional composure, despite circumstances that would break most people. "Thunder Ridge, this is Alpha Leader. We have 3 urgent casualties, 2 walking wounded. Enemy forces are regrouping for another assault. Weather is deteriorating rapidly, visibility dropping to near zero." Major Sarah Barnes studied the weather reports with growing alarm. "Storm systems are converging from 3 directions. We've got lightning, severe turbulence, and wind shears that exceed safe flying parameters. Visibility will be completely gone within 2 hours." Captain Alex Torres, one of the base's most experienced pilots, shook his head as he reviewed the tactical situation. "Fuel requirements exceed safe margins by 60%. Even if we could reach them, we wouldn't have enough fuel to return with a full load of casualties." Lieutenant Derek Hayes studied the terrain maps with the expression of someone calculating acceptable losses. "Weather window is closing fast. We can't risk additional aircraft and personnel for a mission with less than 15% success probability." Zara felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. They were going to abandon those SEALs. 8 of America's most elite warriors were going to die because the mission parameters fell outside acceptable risk calculations. The same institution that had restricted her flights based on gender assumptions was now preparing to write off a rescue mission because it exceeded their comfort zone. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Rick Donovan delivered what felt like the final blow to any hope of rescue. "Besides," he said, glancing dismissively in Zara's direction, "it's not like we have any pilots qualified for this kind of extreme extraction anyway. This requires real special operations experience, not routine transport skills." The comment was clearly directed at her, and every person in the command center understood the implication. Donovan was using the crisis to reinforce the same gender-based assumptions that had led to her flight restrictions. While 8 SEALs fought for their lives in the mountains, He was scoring political points about female pilot capabilities. Zara felt the familiar burn of being dismissed. But this time was fundamentally different. This time, 8 elite soldiers were going to die while these men made assumptions about her. Qualifications based on policies rather than performance. She stepped forward from her position near the communications station, her voice cutting through the defeatist planning with crystal clarity. "Sir, I volunteer for the mission." The command center fell silent, except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of helicopters on the flight line. Officers turned to stare at the woman they'd barely acknowledged during months of routine operations. Colonel Pierce looked confused, as if she'd materialized from nowhere. "Kane, your transport," he said automatically. "This requires specialized extraction experience." "I have specialized extraction experience, sir," Zara replied, approaching the tactical display with movements that radiated confidence and precision. "Multiple high-risk operations in mountain terrain. I can provide operational details if necessary." She pulled out her hand-drawn topographical map, spreading it beside the official charts with the kind of authority that commanded attention. "I've identified 3 alternative approach routes that avoid the primary weather systems. All require low-level flying through terrain features that aren't marked on standard navigation charts." Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper studied her annotations with growing amazement. The level of detail was extraordinary: wind patterns, natural radar shadows, emergency landing zones, and terrain features that could provide protection from both weather and hostile fire. "How do you know about these approach corridors?" Cooper asked, his engineering background allowing him to recognize the sophisticated analysis underlying her hand-drawn annotations. "I've studied topographical patterns and indigenous travel routes during off-duty time," Zara explained. "These paths were used by local populations for generations before military mapping. The terrain provides natural windbreaks and concealment from enemy observation." Lieutenant Hayes's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he realized that the art projects he'd been mocking represented advanced tactical analysis. "You'd still be flying blind in zero visibility conditions. That's suicidal." Zara nodded calmly. "I've trained in acoustic navigation techniques, flying by sound when electronic instruments fail. It's an old skill, but it works when modern technology becomes unreliable." The room remained skeptical until Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed her technical knowledge firsthand. "Sir, Captain Kane has been studying emergency communication protocols for months. She's asked me about low-frequency signal propagation in severe weather, backup frequency procedures, and acoustic navigation theory. Questions that go way beyond standard pilot training." Colonel Pierce looked at Zara with new attention, and she could see the exact moment when his assumptions began to crumble. Her quiet competence, her methodical preparation, and her technical expertise suddenly appeared in a different context. "Why aren't these capabilities noted in your official service record?" Pierce asked. "Because the missions where I developed these skills are classified above your clearance level, sir," Zara replied matter-of-factly. The weight of classified operations hung in the air like a revelation. Everyone in the room understood the implications of skills learned during missions that couldn't be discussed in official channels. Hayes wasn't ready to accept that his assumptions had been completely wrong. "This is insane," he protested. "You're going to get yourself killed and waste a perfectly good aircraft in the process." Zara turned to face him directly, and something in her expression made him take an involuntary step backward. The quiet transport pilot had been replaced by someone who radiated the kind of confidence that came from surviving situations where failure meant death. "Those 8 SEALs didn't volunteer to die so you could feel comfortable with your prejudices, Lieutenant," she said with deadly calm. The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Pierce stared at Zara for what felt like an eternity, weighing duty against prudence, courage against acceptable risk. and assumptions against demonstrated capability. Finally he spoke. Get her aircraft ready. As the command center erupted into frantic preparation, Zara felt a strange calm settle over her. She'd spent 10 months being underestimated, dismissed, and relegated to routine duties. Now when 8 elite soldiers needed someone willing to attempt the impossible, she was finally being given the chance to prove what she'd known all along. The impossible was merely difficult when you'd been preparing for it your entire career. Zara had 45 minutes to prepare for a mission that every other pilot had declared suicidal. While the command center buzzed with frantic activity around her, she methodically gathered the specialized equipment that she'd been stockpiling for exactly this scenario. Each item had been carefully selected based on lessons learned during classified operations where standard gear had proved inadequate. Her first stop was her quarters, where she retrieved equipment that wasn't part of regulation flight gear. A backup altimeter specifically calibrated for extreme elevation changes in mountain terrain. Hand-copied frequency charts for emergency communications that functioned when standard radios failed due to atmospheric interference. Most critically, a set of acoustic navigation notes she'd developed during classified missions in the Hindu Kush techniques for flying by sound when all electronic systems were compromised or destroyed. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez found her in the equipment locker, methodically checking emergency beacon frequencies and backup communication protocols. Captain Kane, he said, his voice tight with concern, I've been monitoring the weather reports. Conditions are deteriorating faster than the meteorologists predicted. Wind shears are reaching critical levels, and visibility is dropping to 0. Zara looked up from her preparations, meeting his worried gaze with steady confidence. Mendez, I need you to do something for me. Anything, ma'am. If this mission goes sideways, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the full implications of what she was attempting, I want you to ensure the official record shows exactly what happened. No cover-ups, no revised reports to protect anyone's reputation. Those SEALs deserve the truth about who tried to save them and who didn't. Mendez nodded grimly, understanding that she was asking him to document both her courage and others' failures if the worst occurred. You got it, Captain. But Kane... He paused, using her first name for the first time in their professional relationship. Come back alive. You've got nothing left to prove to these people. In the maintenance hangar, Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper was performing final systems checks on Chinook Thunder 6 with an intensity that reflected his awareness of what the aircraft would be asked to endure. He'd worked with Zara on dozens of routine missions and had always been impressed by her attention to detail. Now, watching her methodically inspect every system with the focus of someone whose life would depend on mechanical reliability, he began to understand that there was far more to this quiet pilot than anyone had realized. Kane, he said as she completed her pre-flight inspection, I've been thinking about those alternative routes you marked on your terrain map. How do you know they'll provide stable flight corridors in these weather conditions? Zara continued her inspection as she answered, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over controls and instruments. During my classified deployment, I flew missions that required approaching targets without triggering electronic detection systems. You learn to read terrain differently when stealth matters more than speed, and survival depends on understanding how geography affects both weather patterns and enemy surveillance. Cooper frowned, processing the implications of specialized training that went far beyond standard military aviation. That kind of flying isn't taught in regular flight school. No, it isn't, Zara confirmed, pulling out her hand-drawn topographical map and showing Cooper the detailed annotations of wind patterns, natural radar shadows, and acoustic landmarks. But it's taught in classified programs that prepare pilots for operations where following standard procedures will get people killed. She pointed to specific markings on her map. These canyon passages create Venturi effects that accelerate airflow, but they also provide protection from crosswinds and enemy observation. Indigenous populations used these routes for centuries because they understood something our modern mapping missed, that the safest path isn't always the most direct. 1. Cooper studied the map with growing respect, recognizing graduate-level aerodynamics applied to real-world survival scenarios. This is sophisticated tactical analysis disguised as navigation planning. It's preparation, Zara corrected. Theory doesn't matter when people are bleeding out in hostile territory. As she completed her inspection, Lieutenant Derek Hayes approached. With 2 other junior pilots, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Their body language suggested they'd come to deliver some final attempt at discouraging her from attempting the mission. "Still think you can pull this off?" Hayes asked, his tone carrying the condescension he'd never bothered to hide. "Because when you crash that Chinook, it's going to be the rest of us who have to explain to those SEALs' families why we sent an unqualified pilot on a suicide mission." Zara continued checking her emergency equipment without looking up, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the insult. "Lieutenant, have you ever flown a mission where failure meant someone died?" "Of course I have," Hayes replied defensively. "I'm a combat pilot." "No," Zara said, finally meeting his eyes with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Have you ever flown a mission where failure meant someone you were personally responsible for died? Where their survival depended entirely on your ability to do something that everyone said was impossible?" Jose's confident expression faltered slightly as he realized the distinction she was making. "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point," Zara replied, sealing her emergency equipment bag and slinging it over her shoulder. "Those 8 SEALs don't care about your opinions of my qualifications. They care about whether I can reach them before they bleed out or get overrun by enemy forces." She walked toward her aircraft, her movement radiating the kind of confidence that came from extensive preparation rather than bravado. "I've been preparing for this mission my entire career, Lieutenant. You've been preparing to exclude me from it. We're about to find out which preparation matters more." As she approached Thunder 6, Major Sarah Barnes intercepted her with last-minute communication protocols and emergency procedures. "Kane, I've programmed backup frequencies into your radio system," Barnes said, her voice reflecting both respect and concern. "If standard communications fail, switch to Channel 9. I'll be monitoring continuously from the command center." Colonel Pierce appeared beside them, his expression unreadable as he watched Zara make final preparations for a mission that could either vindicate her capabilities or result in court-martial proceedings for authorizing what others considered a suicide run. "Captain Kane," he said formally, "if you die attempting this rescue, I'll face court-martial for authorizing a mission that violated every safety protocol we have." Zara met his gaze without flinching, understanding that he was acknowledging both the personal and professional risks they were both accepting. "And if I succeed, sir?" "If you succeed," Pierce replied carefully, "I'll rewrite our emergency extraction protocols to include everything you've demonstrated today. I'll also reconsider every assumption this base has made about pilot qualifications and mission assignments." She nodded once, accepting both the challenge and the responsibility. 8. "SEALs are waiting, sir. With respect, discussion time is over." As Zara strapped herself into the pilot seat of Thunder 6, she felt a strange sense of completion settling over her. 10 months of being underestimated had led to this defining moment. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about her capabilities, every restriction placed on her duties had been preparing her for this test of everything she'd learned during years of classified operations. The engines spun up with their familiar whine, and Zara began her final systems check while storm clouds gathered on the horizon like a wall of approaching darkness. Outside her cockpit, she could see base personnel watching her departure with expressions ranging from admiration to disbelief that in 90 minutes, visibility would drop to absolute zero. 8 Navy SEALs would be dead by morning if she failed to reach them. Weather conditions would soon make flying impossible for any aircraft using standard navigation methods. Captain Zara Viper Kane had learned something during her years of invisible preparation. The most dangerous missions were often completed by people no one expected to succeed. And as she lifted off at 15:47 hours, flying alone into weather conditions that should have grounded all aircraft, she carried with her skills that officially didn't exist, and the hopes of 8 elite warriors who had no one else left to count on. Zara lifted off at 15:47 hours alone in Chinook Thunder 6, flying into weather conditions that meteorologists had classified as prohibitive for all aircraft operations. Within minutes of departure, the storm system hit with mountainous fury that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien environment where standard navigation became not just difficult, but potentially fatal. Visibility dropped to less than 30 meters as rain, and sleet hammered the windscreen like liquid ammunition. Wind shears threatened to tear the rotor system apart with each altitude change, and atmospheric pressure variations created turbulence that would have grounded any pilot following regulation safety protocols. But Zara had trained for exactly these conditions during classified operations, where regulation safety protocols were luxuries that people couldn't afford. Back at FOB Thunder Ridge, the command center tracked her progress with mounting anxiety and disbelief. Colonel Pierce stood behind the radar operators, watching Thunder 6's signature move steadily toward the danger zone, despite conditions that should have made flying impossible. "Sir, we're losing her on radar," reported Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh. "Weather interference is creating too much electronic noise for reliable tracking." Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez adjusted his communication equipment, desperately trying to maintain contact through the atmospheric chaos. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder Ridge Control. You copy?" Static filled the speakers for several seconds before Zara's voice came through, calm and professional despite the hell she was flying through. "Thunder Ridge, this is Thunder 6. Visibility near zero, switching to alternative navigation methods. Maintaining course toward last known SEAL. Position." Lieutenant Derek Hayes, who had been monitoring the mission from the back of the command center, stepped forward with obvious agitation. "She should abort now. No one can fly in these conditions. This is exactly what I predicted would happen." "Colonel." Pierce held up his hand for silence, but on the radar screen, Thunder 6 had disappeared entirely, swallowed by electronic interference that made tracking impossible. For all practical purposes, Zara Kane had vanished into a storm system that should have been unsurvivable. 60 miles away, Zara was discovering that her months of preparation were being tested beyond anything she'd experienced during classified operations. Standard navigation failed within the first 10 minutes of flight. GPS signals disappeared into electronic chaos. Radio communications became intermittent whispers lost in atmospheric interference, and visual references were reduced to occasional glimpses of terrain through breaks in the storm clouds. But she had prepared for exactly these conditions. Dropping to 40 feet above the mountain ridges, she began flying by sound and intuition, using techniques learned during missions that officially never existed. The engine noise told her about air density and atmospheric pressure. The way Thunder 6 responded to control inputs revealed wind patterns that were invisible to instruments. The sound of rotors bouncing off terrain features created an acoustic map more reliable than any electronic navigation system. Her hand-drawn, topographical map, folded in her breast pocket, had marked these exact flight corridors. Natural wind passages that provided relatively stable air currents through otherwise impossible terrain. Canyon systems that created Venturi effects, accelerating airflow but protecting against the devastating crosswinds that were tearing apart the atmosphere above them. 30-8 minutes into the flight, she heard it through the chaos of wind and engine noise. The distant sound of automatic weapons fire mixed with the electronic squeal of emergency beacon transmission. SEAL Team Alpha was still alive, still fighting, and still broadcasting their location on multiple frequencies in hopes that someone would be crazy enough to attempt a rescue. Zara adjusted course toward the sound, flying through mountain passages that official maps claimed didn't exist. Her preparation had been accurate. These were routes used by indigenous populations for generations before military cartographers had attempted to impose geometric logic on terrain that followed geological rather than mathematical principles. The acoustic beacon led her through a canyon system that provided natural protection from both weather and enemy observation. As she followed the signal deeper into hostile territory, she began to understand why conventional rescue attempts had failed. The SEAL team wasn't just trapped by enemy forces. They were trapped in terrain that made standard extraction procedures impossible. Back at Thunder Ridge, Rodriguez was monitoring emergency frequencies when his equipment suddenly picked up signal activity. "Sir, I'm detecting beacon transmission on emergency channel 7, he reported to Colonel Pierce. "Signal strength suggests Kane has reached the operational area." Pierce grabbed the microphone. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder Ridge. Do you copy? What's your status?" Through the static came Zara's voice, steady and focused despite the chaos she was flying through. "Thunder Ridge, Thunder 6. I have audio contact with SEAL beacon. Terrain is extremely challenging, but I'm following the signal toward there. Position: weather conditions are severe but manageable using alternative navigation. Thunder 6, weather reports show zero visibility in your sector. How are you maintaining course?" "Acoustic navigation and terrain correlation," Zara replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone using skills that others couldn't understand. "The canyon system is providing protected flight corridors, following indigenous route markers that predate our tactical maps." What Zara saw when she finally located the SEAL team justified every concern about this mission while simultaneously proving that conventional thinking had been inadequate. The downed helicopter lay on its side in a narrow ravine that looked like an aircraft graveyard. The canyon floor was uneven, littered with rocks and debris, with no flat surface large enough for a safe landing under normal circumstances. Through the wreckage, she could see 8 figures in tactical gear, waving frantically at the sound of approaching rotors. Chief Petty Officer Derek Stone was directing the positioning of 3 wounded SEALs on makeshift stretchers while the remaining team members maintained defensive positions against enemy forces that were regrouping for another assault. Landing represented the next impossibility. Zara performed what pilots call an extreme pinnacle approach, setting the aircraft down on terrain that violated every safety protocol in military aviation. She used the slope of the ravine wall to help absorb the impact, touched one landing, geared to solid ground while keeping the other suspended over open space, and held the aircraft in position through pure control inputs and engine management. The SEALs moved with desperate efficiency, loading their wounded while Zara maintained the impossible hover. Petty Officer First Class Ryan Mitchell, who had been shot through the shoulder, helped carry Petty Officer Second Class Jake Torres, whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel during the initial ambush, the most critically injured SEAL Chief Petty. Officer Marcus Webb had lost consciousness during the transfer. Through her peripheral vision, Zara could see the team medic performing emergency treatment while she prepared for what would be the most challenging takeoff of her career. "He's stabilized but critical," the medic shouted over the rotor noise. "We need to get him to trauma surgery within the hour." Zara lifted off using a technique she'd learned during an emergency extraction in Kandahar, using ground effect and rotor wash to literally bounce the aircraft off the ravine walls until she gained enough altitude to clear the rim. The maneuver required split-second timing and engine management that pushed Thunder 6 beyond its normal performance parameters. The return flight became a race against time. physics, and enemy forces that were now actively hunting for the rescue helicopter. Overloaded with casualties and medical equipment, Thunder 6 flew at the absolute edge of its performance envelope. Every gust of wind threatened to stall the rotors. Every course correction required more power than the engines could sustain. Indefinitely. But Zara had calculated these margins during her pre-flight planning. She knew exactly how much punishment the aircraft could absorb, exactly which shortcuts through the mountain terrain would save critical minutes, and exactly when to risk everything on decisions that conventional training would have prohibited. At FOB Thunder Ridge, Mendez suddenly straightened in his communication chair. "Sir, I'm reading aircraft strobes on approach vector," he announced. "Thunder 6 is coming home." Colonel Pierce rushed to the window and through the storm saw rotating lights approaching through rain and darkness. Thunder 6's emergency strobes cut through the weather like a beacon of impossible success, carrying AV SEALs who had been written off as casualties. Just 2 hours earlier, Zara set the aircraft down with precision that placed the cargo ramp exactly where the medical team needed it, despite landing harder than regulation allowed. Before the rotors stopped spinning, medics were rushing toward Thunder 6 to receive casualties that everyone had assumed they'd never see alive. 7 of the 8 SEALs were conscious and stable. The 8th, Chief Petty Officer Webb, had a pulse that grew stronger with each passing minute of medical attention. As Zara shut down the engines and sat in the pilot's seat for several seconds, rain drumming against the windscreen, the magnitude of what she'd accomplished began to settle over her. She'd flown a mission that every expert had declared impossible, using skills that officially didn't exist, guided by preparation that others had dismissed as paranoia. When she finally climbed out of the aircraft, her flight suit soaked with sweat and adrenaline, she found Colonel Pierce waiting with an expression she'd never seen before, something between amazement and profound respect. "Kane," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The debriefing room at 0700 hours the next morning was packed beyond its normal capacity. Word had spread through FOB Thunder Ridge overnight about the impossible rescue, and now every pilot, officer, and senior enlisted personnel wanted to hear exactly how Captain Zara Kane had accomplished what the entire Flight Operations Command had declared suicidal. Colonel Pierce sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Major Sarah Barnes and Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper. Zara sat across from them, still wearing the same flight suit from the previous day, her hands steady as she spread her hand-drawn topographical maps across the polished surface. The maps that Lieutenant Hayes had mocked as art projects were now being studied with the intensity reserved for classified intelligence documents. "Let's start with your approach route," Pierce said, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been present during previous interactions. Official weather reports showed zero visibility and catastrophic wind conditions throughout the target sector. "How did you navigate to the SEAL team's position?" Zara pointed to her annotated map, her finger tracing the route she'd flown through. "Terrain that wasn't supposed to provide safe passage." "The official weather reports were based on open terrain measurements, sir. These canyon passages create microclimates that provide protected flight corridors. Indigenous populations used these routes for centuries because they understood wind patterns that our modern meteorology overlooks." Major Barnes leaned forward, studying the detailed annotations that showed wind patterns, natural radar shadows, and acoustic landmarks. "This level of terrain analysis. Where did you learn to read geography like this?" "Classified operations in Afghanistan," Zara replied calmly. "Missions that required approaching targets without triggering electronic detection systems. When stealth matters more than speed, you learn to think about terrain as a tool rather than an obstacle." Lieutenant Derek Hayes, sitting in the back row, looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. The same pilot who had dismissed her preparation as amateur fantasy was now watching her explain graduate-level tactical navigation to a room full of senior officers who were taking detailed notes. Chief Warrant Officer Cooper spoke up, his engineering background helping him understand the technical sophistication of what she'd accomplished. "Captain, you mentioned acoustic navigation during the rescue. How do you fly by sound when all instrument systems are unreliable?" "Engine noise reflection off terrain features creates an audible map," Zara explained, pulling out a notebook filled with hand-copied procedures. "Air density changes affect rotor performance in predictable ways. When you've trained in these techniques, flying becomes less about visual references and more about understanding how the aircraft interacts with its environment." The room fell silent as officers processed the implications of navigation skills that weren't taught in any standard military program. Captain Alex Torres, who had initially been skeptical of the rescue mission, raised his hand. "These techniques aren't part of normal flight training. Where did you develop this expertise?" "Classified programs that prepare pilots for operations where standard procedures will get people killed," Zara replied matter-of-factly. "Programs that officially don't exist, for missions that officially never happened." The weight of classified operations hung in the air like a revelation. Everyone in the room understood they were learning about capabilities that existed in compartmentalized programs far above their normal clearance levels. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez, who had been monitoring communications during the rescue, stood up from his position near the back of the room. "Sir, during the mission, Captain Kane used emergency frequency protocols that aren't in our standard manual. She maintained communications when all other aircraft would have been completely cut off." Zara pulled out her hand-copied frequency charts, documents that looked unremarkable but represented years of specialized training. Low-frequency radio propagation behaves differently in severe weather conditions. These frequencies were developed for Arctic operations where standard communications fail routinely. Colonel Pierce consulted his notes, clearly struggling to reconcile the pilot sitting before him with the assumptions that had led to her flight restrictions. "Captain Kane, your official service record shows standard transport operations. Number. Mention of specialized navigation training or classified mission experience. Because the missions where I developed these skills are classified above your clearance level." "Sir," Zara said without defensiveness or arrogance, "the operations don't exist in accessible records, and the training programs that prepare pilots for those operations are compartmentalized beyond normal personnel files." Chief Petty Officer Derek Stone, the SEAL team leader who had been treated overnight for wounds sustained during the ambush, had been invited to provide his perspective on the rescue. His left arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear and focused as he addressed the assembled officers. "I've been extracted from hostile territory 14 times during my career," Stone said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived situations that killed other people. "I've been picked up by some of the best pilots in military aviation. What Captain Kane accomplished yesterday was beyond anything I've experienced." He gestured toward Zara with obvious respect. She landed in terrain that shouldn't have been possible for rotary wing aircraft. The approach required precision that exceeded anything covered in standard training. Without her willingness to attempt what everyone else called impossible, 8 Navy SEALs would be dead right now. The room remained quiet as Stone's testimony sank in. This wasn't just technical admiration from fellow aviators. This was life and death. Validation from the people who had been saved. Major Barnes broke the silence with a question that had been troubling her since the mission briefing. "Captain Kane, I need to ask directly, how many of our current emergency protocols are inadequate based on your experience?" Zara considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence policies that affected every pilot on the base. "Ma'am, your protocols are adequate for standard emergency scenarios, but they assume that emergency conditions will remain within predictable parameters. When conditions exceed those parameters, current protocols become limitations rather than guidelines." Explain. She stood and approached the tactical display, pointing to the mission route from the previous day. Standard procedure would have required a minimum ceiling of 800 feet and visibility of at least 3 miles. Those conditions didn't exist yesterday. So standard procedure would have meant abandoning the mission and accepting the loss of 8 special operations personnel. Hayes, unable to contain himself any longer, stood up from his back row seat. Because it was a suicide mission. You got lucky, that's all. Zara turned to face him, and the room went dead quiet. Lieutenant, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. I spent 10 months preparing for conditions that everyone else declared impossible. When those conditions occurred, I was ready. You could have died, Hayes protested, his voice carrying desperation rather than conviction. 8 SEALs would have died if I hadn't tried, Zara replied simply. Their lives mattered more than my comfort with risk assessment. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption the base had made about acceptable risk and mission parameters. Colonel Pierce made notes for several minutes before looking up. Captain Kane, effective immediately, you're promoted to Senior Flight Operations Officer. Your first assignment is to develop comprehensive emergency navigation training for all combat pilots. Zara nodded once. Yes, sir. Furthermore, Pierce continued, all previous restrictions on female pilots are rescinded immediately. Mission assignments will be based solely on qualifications and operational requirements. The transformation was visible throughout the room. Pilots who had dismissed Zara's expertise just 24 hours earlier were now asking detailed questions about her techniques, requesting training schedules, and treating her with the kind of respect that came from proven competence under impossible conditions. But perhaps the most significant change was subtler. The culture of dismissive assumptions was being replaced by a culture of curiosity and learning. Instead of deciding what people couldn't do based on surface characteristics, officers were beginning to ask what hidden capabilities might exist beneath conventional expectations. As the briefing concluded and pilots began approaching Zara with requests for specialized training, she felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with creating systemic improvements that would save lives in future emergencies. 8 Navy SEALs were alive because someone had refused to accept that impossible was anything more than difficult. And now that refusal was transforming everything that came after. 2 weeks after the rescue that had rewritten FOB Thunder Ridge's understanding of impossible missions, Zara stood before her first advanced emergency navigation class. 43 pilots, including several who had dismissed her expertise just days earlier, filled the training room with an attention level she'd never experienced before. Lieutenant Derek Hayes sat in the front row, his expression a complex mixture of embarrassment, curiosity, and grudging respect. The same pilot who had mocked her art projects was now taking detailed notes as she explained how hand-drawn terrain analysis could provide critical information that electronic systems missed during emergency operations. Traditional GPS navigation assumes that the shortest distance between 2 points represents the safest route, Zara explained, pointing to a topographical display that showed the rescue route from 2 weeks earlier. But in extreme weather conditions, the safest route is often the one that uses terrain features for protection from both environmental hazards and enemy observation. She pulled out the same map that Hayes had ridiculed, now laminated and marked as official training material. The detailed annotations that had once been dismissed as amateur fantasy were now being studied as examples of advanced tactical analysis. These canyon passages aren't just alternative routes, she continued. They're survival corridors that can mean the difference between completing a mission and becoming another casualty statistic. Understanding how to identify and use these corridors requires thinking about geography as a tactical tool rather than simply an obstacle to overcome. Major Sarah Barnes, who had requested permission to attend the class despite her seniority, raised her hand. Captain Kane, how do you identify these protected corridors without flying them first? What are the visual and topographical indicators that suggest a passage will provide stable flight conditions? Zara approached the terrain model that had been constructed for the training program. First, you study historical weather patterns, indigenous travel routes, and geological formations. People have been moving through dangerous terrain for thousands of years, and their paths weren't random. They were solutions to problems we're just now recognizing in military aviation. The class spent 3 hours covering acoustic navigation, techniques, emergency frequency protocols, and risk assessment procedures that went far beyond standard pilot training. Zara noticed that even the most skeptical pilots were taking comprehensive notes, asking technical questions, and approaching the material with the kind of seriousness that came from understanding its life-saving potential. But the real transformation was visible throughout the base's operational structure. For the first time in FOB Thunder Ridge's history, pilot assignments were based purely on qualifications and mission requirements, rather than gender assumptions. 3 female pilots had been assigned to high-risk extraction teams, and 2 had already completed successful missions that would have been closed to them under the previous policies. Captain Jessica Park, one of the pilots who had benefited from the policy changes, approached Zara after the training session. "The acoustic navigation techniques you taught us saved my mission last Tuesday," Park reported. "When our instruments failed due to electrical interference, I was able to maintain course using engine sound reflection, exactly like you demonstrated." The success wasn't limited to individual missions. The base had developed what Colonel Pierce privately called the Kane standard, a comprehensive approach to emergency preparedness that assumed impossible conditions might occur and planned accordingly. Zara's emergency navigation course had become mandatory training for all combat pilots, and requests for the program were coming in from bases throughout the theater of operations. What had started as one pilot's private preparation had evolved into military doctrine that was saving lives across the region. The most recent success story involved Captain Lisa Torres, who had used Zara's terrain analysis techniques to complete a medical evacuation during a sandstorm that had grounded all other aircraft. I followed the natural wind corridors that Captain Kane identified during her terrain mapping course, Torres reported during the weekly operations briefing. The route took longer than direct approach, but it was the only way to maintain stable flight in those conditions. The patient wouldn't have survived if we'd waited for the weather to clear. Lieutenant Hayes had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of anyone on the base. The pilot who had once mocked Zara's preparation now spent his off-duty hours studying topographical maps and practicing emergency frequency protocols with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I realized that everything I thought made me a good pilot was just surface-level confidence, he admitted during a private conversation with Major Barnes. Real competence means being ready for conditions that don't appear in the manual, and Captain Kane understood that while the rest of us were just playing at being aviators, his transformation wasn't unique. Across the base, pilots were asking different questions and studying different materials. The culture of assumption and exclusion had been replaced by a culture of preparation and continuous learning. Officers were beginning to recognize that excellence could exist in forms they hadn't previously considered. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez, who had been monitoring emergency communications during the original SEAL rescue, had been promoted to Senior Operations Coordinator. He credited Zara's influence with changing how the base approached crisis management and emergency response. Before Captain Kane, we prepared for emergencies by following standard procedures, Mendez explained to a group of visiting officers from other installations. Now we prepare by assuming that standard procedures might not be adequate. It's a completely different mindset, and it saved lives that we would have lost under the old system. Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper had implemented new maintenance standards based on Zara's approach to aircraft preparation. Despite being assigned to routine missions, She had continued maintaining her helicopter to specifications that exceeded normal requirements, and that attention to detail had proved critical during the rescue mission. Kane maintained Thunder 6 like she expected to need maximum reliability under extreme conditions, Cooper told his maintenance staff during their weekly briefing. That preparation made the difference between mission success and mechanical failure during the most challenging flight operation this base has ever attempted. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation operations. The base had begun recognizing expertise in other areas that had previously been overlooked. A supply sergeant's innovative logistic solutions were now part of official procedures. A communications technician's insights into equipment reliability had prevented multiple mission failures. An administrative specialist's organizational systems had been adopted throughout the command structure. Zara's success had created permission for others to demonstrate capabilities that hadn't fit conventional expectations. The base was discovering that excellence existed in forms they hadn't been looking for, and that their ability to identify and utilize hidden expertise could determine the success or failure of critical operations. Colonel Pierce, reflecting on the transformation during his weekly command review, made notes that would influence military policy for years to come. The most dangerous operational assumption is that we can predict capability based on conventional indicators, he wrote in his official report. Excellence exists in forms we don't always recognize, and our ability to identify and utilize that excellence may determine mission success in critical situations. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Chief Petty Officer Derek Stone, the SEAL team leader who had been rescued during the impossible mission, had requested permission to address the base during the monthly awards ceremony. 8 Navy SEALs are alive today because Captain Kane refused to accept limitations that others considered absolute, Stone told the assembled personnel. She proved that preparation matters more than prejudice, that capability exists in forms we don't always recognize, and that the most reliable people are often the ones who don't need recognition to do their jobs. As applause filled the ceremony hall, Zara felt a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. The base had learned something that would influence decisions long after her deployment ended. That assuming you know what people can do based on surface characteristics is the most dangerous assumption any organization can make. Excellence, she had proven, flies without permission. And now everyone knew it. 6 months after the rescue that had fundamentally altered FOB Thunder Ridge's operational philosophy, the transformation had become so complete that new arrivals couldn't imagine the base operating under any other system. Captain Zara Kane's influence had rippled through every aspect of military operations, creating changes that extended far beyond aviation and emergency response. The most visible transformation was in mission assignment protocols. The board that had once automatically excluded female pilots based on gender assumptions now displayed assignments determined purely by qualifications, experience, and mission requirements. 4 female pilots had been promoted to senior flight positions, and 3 had received commendations for successful operations that would have been impossible under the previous restrictive policies. But the deeper change was cultural and philosophical. FOB Thunder Ridge had developed what visiting officers called the Thunder Ridge Standard, a comprehensive approach to military operations that assumed conventional limitations might not represent actual boundaries of what was possible. Zara's emergency navigation course had become the foundation for a complete reimagining of how the military prepared personnel for crisis situations. The most recent validation of this new approach had occurred just 2 weeks earlier when Captain Jessica Park successfully completed a hostage extraction in weather conditions that would have grounded all aircraft under the old operational guidelines. Using terrain analysis techniques developed during Zara's training program, Park had navigated through a mountain storm system to evacuate 12 civilians from a compound under siege. The acoustic navigation training made the difference between mission success and abandoning those hostages, Park reported during the post-mission debriefing. When our electronic systems failed, I was able to maintain course using the sound techniques Captain Kane taught us. Those civilians are alive because we learned to think beyond conventional limitations. Lieutenant Derek Hayes had become one of Zara's most dedicated students and effective advocates for the new training methods. The pilot who had once dismissed her expertise as amateur fantasy now spent his off-duty hours developing supplementary materials for the emergency navigation program. I spent 3 years thinking I understood what made someone a good pilot, Hayes admitted during a conversation with Colonel Pierce. Confidence, quick reflexes, the ability to make split-second decisions. When I saw Captain Kane studying maps and practicing emergency procedures, I thought she was overcomplicating simple tasks. He paused, clearly still processing the magnitude of his previous misconceptions. I was wrong about everything. She wasn't overcomplicating anything. She was preparing for conditions that the rest of us couldn't even imagine. When those conditions occurred, her preparation saved 8 lives while our conventional thinking would have gotten people killed. Hayes's transformation had become representative of a broader shift in military thinking. Officers throughout the command structure were beginning to question assumptions about capability, qualification, and readiness that had gone unexamined for decades. Major Sarah Barnes, who had been promoted to deputy base commander, credited Zara's influence with changing fundamental approaches to personnel evaluation and mission planning. Before Captain Kane, we evaluated pilots based on standard metrics that measured performance under normal conditions, Barnes explained to a visiting delegation from Pentagon leadership. Now we evaluate them based on their ability to function when normal conditions don't exist. It's a completely different standard, and it's producing completely different results. The Pentagon delegation had come to FOB Thunder Ridge specifically to study the operational changes that had emerged from what was officially being called the Thunder Ridge Innovation. Military leadership was interested in understanding how a single rescue mission had generated systematic improvements that were being requested by bases throughout the theater. Technical Sergeant Carlos Mendez, now serving as Senior Communications Coordinator, had documented the evolution of emergency response protocols since Zara's arrival. His analysis showed measurable improvements in mission success rates, casualty reduction, and operational readiness that correlated directly with the implementation of her training methods. The data is clear, Mendez reported during the Pentagon briefing. Since implementing Captain Kane's emergency procedures, we've completed 14 missions that would have been classified as impossible under previous protocols. Our casualty rates for high-risk operations have dropped by 67%, and our operational readiness has increased across all metrics. But the most significant change was philosophical rather than statistical. The base had learned to distinguish between actual limitations and assumed limitations, between reasonable caution and paralyzing risk aversion. Officers were making decisions based on capability assessment rather than conventional expectations. Chief Warrant Officer Frank Cooper had implemented maintenance standards that reflected this new approach to preparation and readiness. Aircraft were being maintained to specifications that exceeded normal requirements, and pilots were being trained to understand their equipment at levels that prepared them for conditions beyond standard operational parameters. We learned something important from Captain Kane's approach, Cooper told his maintenance staff during their monthly review. Excellence in maintenance isn't about meeting minimum standards. It's about preparing equipment to function reliably when everything goes wrong simultaneously. The influence extended beyond military operations into broader organizational culture. The base had begun recognizing and utilizing expertise that didn't fit conventional categories. A logistics specialist's innovative supply chain solutions were saving critical resources. A communications technician's insights into equipment reliability were preventing mission failures. Administrative personnel were contributing. Operational improvements that were being adopted throughout the command. Zara's success had created what organizational psychologists called permission to excel, an environment where people felt encouraged to demonstrate capabilities that went beyond their official job descriptions. The base was discovering reserves of expertise and innovation that had existed but hadn't been recognized or utilized. Colonel Pierce, preparing for his rotation to a new command, reflected on the transformation in his final report to military leadership. The most important lesson from the Thunder Ridge experience is that our assumptions about human capability are often our greatest operational limitation, he wrote. When we stopped making decisions based on conventional expectations and started making them based on demonstrated competence, we discovered capabilities that dramatically improved our operational effectiveness. The report continued. Captain Kane's rescue of SEAL Team Alpha was successful not because she possessed superhuman abilities, but because she had prepared for conditions that others considered impossible. The real innovation wasn't in her flying technique, it was in her refusal to accept assumed limitations as actual boundaries. But perhaps the most lasting change was in how the base thought about recognition and leadership. The culture that had once valued visibility and conventional confidence now valued preparation, competence, and the kind of quiet excellence that didn't require recognition to maintain its standards. Zara continued her dual role as senior flight operations officer and active pilot, though her mission profile had expanded far beyond routine transport duties. She was now assigned to the most challenging extractions and emergency operations, often serving as backup for missions that pushed the boundaries of standard protocols. The base motto had been quietly updated to reflect their new understanding. Preparation enables the impossible. Excellence serves without recognition. Lives are saved by those who refuse to accept conventional limitations. As Zara completed her evening preparation, routine still studying weather patterns and emergency procedures with the same methodical intensity that had characterized her approach from the beginning. She felt satisfaction that came from creating something better than what had existed before. 8 Navy SEALs had returned home to their families because someone had refused to accept that impossible was anything more than a starting point. And that refusal had changed everything that came after, creating a legacy of excellence that would influence military operations for years to come. 1 year after the rescue that had redefined what was possible at FOB Thunder Ridge, Captain Zara Kane stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, delivering the keynote address for the annual Military Innovation Conference. The same pilot who had once been invisible in briefing rooms was now speaking to senior military leadership from across all branches of service about lessons learned from what was officially designated as the Thunder Ridge transformation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent most of her career being overlooked and underestimated, and now she was being asked to explain how individual excellence could drive institutional change. But as she looked out at the assembled officers, she understood that the real story wasn't about her personal vindication. It was about what happened when organizations stopped making assumptions about capability and started recognizing expertise wherever it existed. The most dangerous assumption any military organization can make, Zara began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from proven competence under impossible conditions, is that we can predict capability based on conventional indicators. When we stopped evaluating pilots based on gender, rank, or traditional career paths, and started evaluating them based on actual readiness for extreme conditions, we discovered capabilities that dramatically improved our operational effectiveness. Audience included generals, admirals, and senior civilian leadership who had come to understand how one impossible rescue mission had generated systematic improvements that were being studied and implemented throughout the military. The Thunder Ridge model was now being adapted by bases across multiple theaters of operation. General Patricia Williams, the conference organizer, had specifically requested that Zara address the human factors that had made the transformation possible. Captain Kane, what would you say to commanders who want to implement similar changes, but are concerned about disrupting established operational procedures? Zara considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would influence policy decisions affecting thousands of military personnel. Ma'am, the question isn't whether change will disrupt established procedures. The question is whether those procedures are adequate for the challenges we actually face in the field. She clicked to a slide showing mission success rates from FOB Thunder Ridge before and after the policy changes. These numbers represent lives saved and missions completed that would have failed under our previous assumptions about pilot qualifications. When the choice is between comfortable procedures and effective operations, the choice should be obvious. The presentation continued for 45 minutes, covering tactical innovations, training methodologies, and organizational culture changes that had emerged from the Thunder Ridge experience. But the most powerful moments came when Zara shared testimonials from the people whose lives had been affected by the transformation. Chief Petty Officer Derek Stone, who had recovered fully from his injuries during the SEAL Team Alpha rescue, had provided a video statement that was played during the presentation. 8 Navy SEALs are alive today because Captain Kane proved that excellence exists in forms we don't always recognize, Stone said from his new assignment in Virginia. She showed us that the most reliable people are often the ones who don't need recognition to maintain their standards. Lieutenant Derek Hayes, who had completed his transformation from skeptic to advocate, had also contributed a statement that reflected the personal growth that had occurred throughout the Thunder Ridge command structure. I spent 3 years thinking I understood what made someone qualified for high-risk operations, Hayes admitted in his recorded remarks. Captain Kane taught me that real qualifications aren't about confidence or conventional credentials. They're about preparation for conditions that everyone else considers impossible. The Pentagon leadership was particularly interested in the scalability of the Thunder Ridge innovations. Could the principles that had worked at a single forward operating base be applied to larger military organizations with more complex command structures? Major Sarah Barnes, now serving as Colonel Barnes after her promotion and transfer to a strategic planning role, addressed this question during the panel discussion that followed Zara's presentation. The key insight from Thunder Ridge is that excellence often exists in places where we're not looking for it, Barnes explained. When we created systems for recognizing and utilizing capabilities that didn't fit conventional categories, we discovered resources that had been invisible to traditional evaluation methods. The conference concluded with the announcement of new military policies that incorporated lessons learned from the Thunder Ridge experience. The Kane protocols would be implemented across all branches of service, establishing standardized procedures for identifying and developing non-traditional expertise within military organizations. But for Zara, the most meaningful recognition had come earlier that morning, when she'd received a handwritten letter from Petty Officer Second Class Jake Torres, one of the SEALs who had been wounded during the original rescue mission. Torres was now fully recovered and serving with a new SEAL team, but he'd taken time to write about the impact of that impossible rescue on his perspective about capability and preparation. Captain Kane, the letter read, "My daughter is now old enough to understand what happened during my rescue mission. When I tell her the story, I don't focus on the danger or the heroism. I focus on the lesson that the most important qualifications can't always be seen from the outside." She's growing up knowing that excellence comes in many forms, and that preparation matters more than recognition. As Zara prepared to return to her current assignment, she was now serving as Director of Advanced Flight Operations at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she was implementing Thunder Ridge protocols on a larger scale. She reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible transport pilot to military innovation leader. The transformation hadn't been about proving herself to people who had underestimated her capabilities. It had been about proving that excellence existed in forms that traditional evaluation methods missed, and that organizations became stronger when they learned to recognize and utilize all available expertise. The base motto from FOB Thunder Ridge had been adopted by military installations worldwide. Preparation enables the impossible. Excellence serves without recognition. Lives are saved by those who refuse to accept conventional limitations. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the thousands of military personnel who had learned to see capability differently. Officers were asking different questions during personnel evaluations. Commanders were looking for expertise in unexpected places. Training programs were preparing people for conditions that exceeded normal parameters. The culture of assumption and exclusion had been replaced by a culture of curiosity and preparation. Instead of deciding what people couldn't do based on surface characteristics, military leadership was learning to ask what hidden capabilities might exist beneath conventional expectations. As Zara boarded her flight back to Kentucky, she carried with her the satisfaction that came from creating something better than what had existed before. 8 Navy SEALs had gone home to their families because someone had refused to accept that impossible was anything more than a starting point. But the real victory was in the systematic changes that had followed changes that would save lives for years to come. By recognizing that excellence flies without permission, courage serves without condition, and the greatest achievements are often accomplished by people no one expected to succeed. The story had never been about one pilot's heroic rescue. It had been about what happened when organizations learned to see clearly, prepare thoroughly, and trust competence over convention. And that lesson would continue transforming military operations long after Captain Zara Viper Kane had moved on to new challenges and new opportunities to prove that the impossible was merely difficult for those who refused to accept assumed limitations as actual boundaries. In briefing rooms and training facilities, in crisis moments and routine operations, the question was no longer whether someone fit conventional expectations of capability. The question was whether they were prepared to do what needed to be done when everyone thought they knew about possible and impossible turned out to be wrong. And in a world that often mistakes volume for value and confidence for competence, that question had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.